Each year, thousands of seabirds return to a handful of very special islands along the coast of Maine to nest and raise their young. The story of these seabirds is a chronicle of a resource nearly lost due to human thoughtlessness and misunderstanding. It's also a conservation epic, a tale that shows how people can help other species to survive in a world where human interests often place them in jeopardy. Wonder at the beauty. Question the lack of wisdom that nearly caused the demise of some of these marvelous birds. And meet some of the dedicated people who are making a difference for these most fascinating creatures, the seabirds of the Maine coast. John Anderson is a conservation biologist with the College of the Atlantic.
Back in the late 19th century, it was very, very popular indeed for young ladies of fashion to wear dead birds on their heads. And there was an enormous millinery trade. Initially, the hunters would go out and take the really jazzy birds, herons, egrets, things like that, shoot them, stuff them, and they'd be turned into fashionable hats. When they ran out of the herons, they started going after more exotic birds. Terns were certainly taken. Eventually they ran out of terns, they took gulls. And by the 1890s, virtually no seabirds were left breeding, essentially between the Canadian line and down into the Carolinas. An enormous, devastating impact by the hunting trade on seabird populations. Probably the seabirds had already been hurting, at least here in Maine, before that, because in the 19th century, road transportation was still pretty unreliable, but sea transportation you could count on, and Maine's always had an enormous maritime heritage. So all of the islands along the coast were, by and large, being used for human purposes. They either had permanent year-round settlements on them, or else they would be used for sheep, goats, other livestock as grazing grounds. The nice thing about an island is you don't need to worry about fencing. So most of these islands had been cut over, grazed over, people living on them, and even if they weren't permanent communities, a lot of times people would come out here in the summer, set up a fishing camp, fish from open boats from May until the weather cracked up in October. Then they'd go inshore with their catch they would have been salting or smoking on the island. Of course, the trouble with being out here, May through October, that's just the time that the seabirds want to come and nest. And so I think a combination of direct kill from the hunters and also the disturbance of having either humans or their livestock on the islands had this tremendous impact on the seabird populations.
At the end of the 1800s, seabirds were considered eaten off the coast of Maine. Their eggs and the birds themselves were all shot year-round, persecuted in some terms. Some birds were shot for just their wings. Others, like an eider duck, would have been pursued for the flesh, the feathers, and the eggs. At the turn of the century, one spectacular event occurred is that eiders, which were nesting on Maine islands earlier, were nesting at an all-time low of 2 pairs in eastern Maine in 1907. And the precursor of the Audubon Society protected the island where those 2 birds were nesting. And then there are numerous laws that protected eiders from year-round harvest. The hunting seasons were established 40 years later. There was a moratorium for 40 years on shooting eiders. People left the islands. That's probably as important as the laws to protect the birds, was the fact that man left Maine's islands to go live on the mainland where it was more comfortable, and they left the birds alone.
The first Audubon wardens were actually in Maine, and they were actually light keepers hired by the Audubon Society. There used to be a lot of feather hunting for the millinery trade out on these islands, and the first warden actually was employed at Matinicus Rock, and that was in 1900. The Lighthouse Islands were the places where the birds could keep healthy populations, when everywhere else they were just being slaughtered until there were other laws to protect the birds.
With the year-round protection afforded by the laws, populations recovered tremendously. Some were over this century have just improved geometrically, logarithmically is the correct term, and the number of eiders have gone from 2 pairs to probably 27,000, 28,000 pairs today. The other birds have recovered differently at different rates. Gulls are certainly very numerous. Terns were very, very numerous in the 30s, and as the gulls increased, tern numbers went down because gulls were preying on tern eggs and tern chicks. So with some management and some work with National Audubon and others, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service primarily, we've managed to restore tern numbers to almost historic highs. There's 3 species of terns that nest on Maine islands: the Arctic tern, the common tern, and the roseate tern. The roseate is listed as a federally endangered species worldwide. Its numbers are imperiled. We've never had huge numbers of roseates nesting in Maine, and therefore the population goal that we're shooting for is 250 pairs. And just to keep it somewhat in perspective, last year we had 234 pairs nesting in Maine, so we're very, very close to reaching that goal. But obviously roseate terns are more numerous in other places. But in Maine, we have an objective of returning them to a historic level, and that we believe to be around 250 pairs. So, the Arctic tern is a fascinating bird to work with, and particularly when you're on an island where they're nesting in relatively good numbers and you see 2 pairs of terns incubating 2 eggs, knowing that these birds have made a approximately 25,000-mile round trip from the island 1 year previous. They in the fall, after the nesting season is concluded in Maine, they head to the southern hemisphere, often flying by way of the Canary Islands, off the coast of Africa down to the Antarctic, where they spend what is our winter. And then they make the return trip the next spring to the particular island they nested previously and do it all over again. It's been rumored to be about a 25,000-mile round trip. And these birds can do it for 30 or 35 years. They're a very long-lived bird and a lot of frequent flyer miles. The common tern is a denizen of the coast of Maine that all of us know and love, and at one time their numbers were perilously low. People were starting to write at the turn of the century, what would the coast of Maine be like without common terns flying along the shore? Their numbers are improving because of the work of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and National Audubon Society, particularly by making a half a dozen islands gull-free, allowing these terns to nest successfully. Terns will try to nest year after year on a particular spot, but if it's overrun with black-backed gulls, they just never successfully produce any young. So we've collaborated with several agencies to make a half a dozen islands gull-free, giving the terns the opportunity to pull off 2 or 3 young every year. They're more of an inshore tern, and we see them more along the coast. Arctic terns tend to be a little further out in the Gulf. So it's the bird we see at Puffin Beach and various coastal areas of Maine. Doing quite well. They're very near the population goal that we've established for common terns, and we're going to keep working with them. Black guillemots are a species that's nesting in abundance now. Looking at the literature, we believe that the numbers of black guillemots probably were not as perilously low as a lot of the other seabirds because they nest in rock cracks on outer islands. It's very difficult to go out and search for their eggs. If I was to go collect eggs in the late 1800s, you would have really had to get down on your hands and knees to look for guillemot eggs, but whereas the gull and the eider eggs would be right up in front of you. So the numbers probably didn't get that low. They aren't that tasty, so they weren't used for food. They were used for bait, I understand, for fishing. Their numbers are very secure now. We got them nesting on, my records show, 170 islands, doing very, very well. The Atlantic puffin is nesting at the southern extreme in the North Atlantic on 4 Maine islands. History shows that it nested on just 8, so the work that's being done by the National Audubon Society to restore puffins to former levels is exemplary. The work has been used as a pioneering restoration project for pioneering seabirds, have been used worldwide now by Dr. Steve Kress and his associates at the National Audubon Society. Puffins, too, were suffering from excessive predation by gulls, so the Audubon Society, with help, made a few sites gull-free and allowed the puffins to nest unencumbered by avian predators. But there were no puffins nesting around the turn of the century, or just maybe a few pairs left on Matinicus Rock. So what Dr. Kress and his colleagues did in the 1970s was to go import young from Newfoundland and raise them on the Maine islands. And those birds eventually at age 5 or older would come back to the island and nest themselves. And very labor-intensive project. Puffins are not rare by any stretch. They're uncommon in Maine. They are the darling of the National Audubon Society, and they're a special denizen of Maine seabird life. Razorbill is a cousin of the puffin. They're actually a little bit larger. They nest on just 3 islands in Maine, and all 3 are in conservation ownership. Matinicus Rock, Freeman Rock, which is in eastern Maine, and Old Man Island. They're having some trouble nesting in the presence of black-backed gulls, so they do best on Matinicus Rock where there are no black-backed gulls nesting. Usually and always lays 1 egg, and as soon as the egg hatches, they leave the island to get away from the gulls. And the numbers are quite low, but they probably were never really, really high in Maine. They're common to the north, and we estimate about 250 pairs on those 3 sites. The gulls that are the primary predator of the young of a lot of these other seabirds are the bigger gulls, the herring gulls and the great blackback gulls. One species of gulls that nests on our islands where we manage for terns and puffins is the laughing gull. The laughing gull is a small gull. It's not particularly predatory in that it can nest amongst terns and not cause problems with egg robbing or predation of chicks. It has been known to steal food from common terns, but as long as they don't actually eat the eggs or eat the young of the terns and the birds that we're trying to restore, they're not a problem. So now we have laughing gulls nesting very securely on 3 tern-managed islands.
The project is a collaborative project with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and it was initiated by my predecessor at the College of the Atlantic, William Drury. And Bill was probably the most knowledgeable person in the last part of this century about the birds of, well, probably coastal New England as a whole. And he'd been tracking the overall distribution of gulls up and down the coast of Maine and the rest of New England for quite a number of years. And from the late 50s on was concerned about the possibility that the territorial gulls, the herring and blackback gulls, would eventually start displacing the other species of seabirds. And working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, he initiated the project here on Titman back in the early 1980s. Titman had been, towards the mid part of the 1960s and into the early 1970s, one of the last surviving large mixed tern colonies here in Maine. And Bill had censused it back in the early 70s, then came back in the late 70s and found that the gulls had moved in and completely wiped it out. So Titman was a logical candidate for a reintroduction program, given that there was still a large number of terns that had living memory of actually breeding successfully here on Titman. So, working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, Bill and a team from the college set about eliminating the gulls from Titman and bringing back the terns. And the college has continued that work as part of a cooperative agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service ever since. This summer, for instance, I've got 2 first-year students working with me. They've had 1 year of classes so far. They're both interested in being field ecologists, and they're spending the summer out here on the seabird colony with me, getting some practical experience actually doing field ecology. So the whole emphasis at the College of the Atlantic is actually learning by doing, and we really feel the best sort of teacher is the practice of the thing that you want to wind up doing. We'd rather not have people who think they'd like to get involved in science wait until they get to graduate school before they actually start doing research. One of the things that concerns me certainly is that when I was in graduate school, a number of my fellow graduate students done very well as undergraduates in a very controlled sort of setting. They never actually had to do real research as an undergraduate, and suddenly they were thrown into a graduate setting where they were expected to start up a research program of their own. They were expected to be able to design experiments, initiate research. They just didn't have any actual training in doing that. So rather than just relying on the book learning, what we've tried to do at the college is get people doing the things that they think they want to wind up doing as quickly as possible. Then they can make an informed judgment. If you come out here for a summer and you're having a really good time in spite of the fog and in spite of the fact that the birds may be attacking you and in spite of the fact there are no showers, that's a pretty good sign that you probably want to go and do this more later on. On the other hand, if you come out here and spend a summer and it was an interesting experience, but you really would much rather to be back in civilization, I think that's a very good piece of information, and it's still plenty of time to change your degree emphasis and to do something else. By the end of the 19th century, Maine was experiencing a major decline in population. People were moving out of the state, heading west. Reliable marine engines allowed you to stay on shore and motor out to the fishing grounds rather than having to live on the outer islands in a fishing camp. Also, the Audubon Society had been very successful in putting through a series of laws banning the use of birds in the millinery trade. And so the market gunners that had been shooting enormous numbers of the birds for hats were essentially put out of business, at least in New England. So a combination of the elimination of the human presence on the outer islands and also the elimination of the hunting pressure seems to have led to a major rebound by most of the seabird populations here in the Northeast. And in some ways, part of what that rebound was fueled by was aspects of the very thing that had pushed the bird population down to begin with. Many of the islands here on Maine were probably wooded islands up until the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And if you've got a wooded island, it's not going to be suitable for many of the seabird species that you see on islands like Petit Manan. They like short vegetation or even bare rock. They like relatively open habitat, and if there are trees, there are almost certainly going to be owls, and owls are significant predators on the seabirds. So by coming out to the islands and clear-cutting them and then grazing them down to next to nothing, humans had more or less accidentally created, in many cases, what seems to be perfect seabird habitat. As long as there were people and their animals on the islands, of course that habitat wasn't available. But as soon as the people left and took their animals with them, suddenly all of these islands were opened up for seabirds. So there seems to have been an enormous surge in populations of just about every species along the coast of Maine following this human removal. And this recovery seems to have extended into probably the early 1930s, with numbers of all populations going up very satisfactorily indeed. And then starting sometime just before the Second War, there seems to have been a break point where the population of herring and blackback gulls, particularly in Maine, the herring gulls initially, started really taking off in an almost exponential fashion, and the other seabird populations began to decline. And by the 1950s, most of the other seabirds seem to have been concentrated to a great degree on the Lighthouse Islands, the islands that the Coast Guard were keeping gull-free, largely as a matter of sanitation. Here on Titmanan, like on many other islands, there's no obvious groundwater source. If you want to have water for washing, drinking, whatever, it has to either be brought out by boat or else you collect rainwater. We bring all of our drinking water out by the boat for washing both ourselves and dishes. We collect rainwater off the roof, very similar to what would have happened here 50, 60 years ago when this was a manned light station. So the Coast Guard kept gulls away from the Lighthouse Islands because the gulls tend to roost on human buildings and foul the water. And it seems that the Coast Guard didn't mind having things like terns and guillemots around. They tend to stay further away from the buildings. They're not a problem. And so the Lighthouse Islands became these, again, accidental sanctuaries for the seabirds.
Working for the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, I have the pleasure of collaborating with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Audubon Society, Maine Audubon Society, the Nature Conservancy, Maine Coast Heritage Trust, the Island Institute, the list goes on and on.
Susan Schubel is a field biologist with the National Audubon Society.
In 1984, I volunteered on Matinicus Rock, and it's very exciting to live on a seabird island. You're bombarded every minute with all your senses. They're really, the terns are very aggressive, and the whole island is covered with terns. They nest right on the rocks, and they're protective of their young because a person walking through could be a big problem for them. So they're very aggressive, and they'll dive bomb you, and they'll shoot shoot guano at you, and they'll peck you in the head until you bleed. That's very exciting. And then that's the huge umbrella over the island of terns. And then you have the next layer of all the nests right on the rocks. And then underneath the rocks, you have all the puffin nests. And they're never quiet. They are screaming 24 hours a day, the terns are. The puffins tend to be quite quiet. But there's never a dull moment on Seabird Islands. It's very exciting, and something is always happening. Even if you've watched them for years and years, there's always something new to see.
Stan Skudik is the refuge manager at the United States Fish and Wildlife Service's Petite Manane National Wildlife Refuge.
These coastal islands are an important and unique part of Maine's coastal ecosystem because they provide nesting habitat for a variety of seabirds, terns, guillemots, puffins, and eiders, some of which nest nowhere else in the United States. And like stepping stones, these islands also provide resting and feeding areas for many birds on their north and south spring and fall migrations. It's important to remember that it's critical not to disturb these birds during the nesting season. And for the seabirds, the puffins, the guillemots, the eiders, this season usually starts around the 1st of April through the end of August. That's when we have our National Wildlife Refuge Seabird Islands closed to the public, from April 1 through August 31. Then they're open the rest of the year to public uses. But it's important that during that nesting season that we don't have undue disturbance on the islands.
The towboat operator has been really very good indeed about keeping the microphone down when they're close into the island, also keeping it a little bit offshore so they aren't right on top of the birds. And after some reflection, I think I'm really rather delighted to see people out there on the boat. One of my big concerns is that if people aren't aware of the existence of a resource like Petite Manane, it's going to be very, very hard indeed to protect it. And whereas one of the reasons that I think it's important to maintain the seabird populations here is strictly moral, a whole question about preservation of other species, there's another whole issue about providing enjoyment and pleasure to one's fellow humans. And these are very beautiful and very interesting birds, and it's really very nice indeed to see other people coming out and being able to sort of experience some of the thrill of seeing these different species and just appreciating the beauty of being out on the water with these different birds flying around them. So it's really very nice indeed to see the boat coming out on a nice day and a number of people on board, and they're getting an experience that they wouldn't be able to get many other places in the world. And I think that when they go home after taking one of these trips, I suspect that their whole attitude about wildlife and the ocean and seabirds may well have undergone something of a change.
Captain Barna Norton has led puffin watch cruises along the Maine coast since the 1940s.
My first trip out here was in 1940, when I claimed the island, which had been left to me by my great-grandfather. I bring the flag to show the people, of whoever happens to be around here, that the island belongs to the United States. It belongs to the United States by treaty. It's an English light on an American island. Canada has been very active recently, but not too active years ago, because they used to even fly the American flag here.
As far as the blinds go, there's 4, 2 there and 2 behind the lighthouse. You'll be in the blinds for about a half hour, 40 minutes. At the end of a half hour, whoever's missed that will come up here and vice versa. There is another group expected within a few minutes. So usually when there's 2 groups, one is in the blinds and one is waiting here.
We used to sail through herring from Jonesport right to this island. There's just one big mass of fish as far as you could see. And there were whales, gulls, porpoises, big pollard jumping out of the water. The most activity you ever saw. As I go sail now, it's a silent spring. There's not very much in the water. It's been completely destroyed by the fishing industry. They started out with catching so many fish that the factories couldn't take care of them. Then it went to putting cat and dog food plants along with that. They couldn't take care of the catch. Went from there to fertilizer plants, and that couldn't take care of them. The last thing they did was catch the herring, kill them, taking the scales off from the fish and throwing them overboard. Then one day, we looked around, there wasn't any fish. We had 105 sardine factories on the Maine coast, and I think we might have 5 now. And they have a hard job to get some fish to peg. It's a very serious thing. We had many birds on this island. We had 20,000 terns, and I think they're down to 2,500. And they have some years they can't get enough food to fledge their young. And they all die. 78, there wasn't a single one flew. They died. By their nest were small dollarfish, which the little terns couldn't get in his mouth, so he starved to death. And that's the story that I want to bring to the young people of our countries, both Canada and the United States. Well, I've taken people from all over the country, the world. I've taken them from South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Taiwan, China, England, you name it, and we've taken them, people from all places. And we've tried very hard for them to have a good time, but also we've tried very hard to protect the island, because when there was no control on this island, I could have destroyed it. I could have gotten rich for 2 or 3 days, and that would have been the end of it.